with us today Rose Iovannone, did I say that correctly? From the University of Florida. And just yesterday, I was speaking to a class at Loyola University, and I was talking about some of the various ISRC services, and was talking about our behavior teams. And I mentioned, and we actually have one tomorrow, and our speaker is Rose Iovannone from University of Florida. And the professor said, we are using her new textbook called Prevent, Teach, and Reinforce. So we are getting a direct presentation straight from the brand new textbook. I had the pleasure of seeing Rose present last year at the National PBIS conference, and out of all the presenters, she really seemed to have a good grasp of the needs of low communication individuals. And she had some good videotapes that were connected to that, and so I was really excited to ask her to come and present to us. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Rose Iovannone.
Thank you, thank you. I wouldn't call our book a textbook, actually. It's like this kind of a book. So you know, that's nice. They have promoted it to textbook status. That's good. Yes, I'm actually from the University of South Florida. I know University of Florida. You know the football teams and everything in Florida. They might take offense if they thought they were being compared to USF, although we do have a good football team this year, so we're hoping. So everybody here is on a behavior team. Is that correct? Yes, this is fantastic. I love Illinois because you guys are one of the states that I look to, especially with Lucille Eber and the PBIS, the state network as well. I always go to your website to look and see what is new and what you're doing, because you guys are one of the states, one of the leaders in the United States in behavior. And I know when you're inside you think, how can that be? Things aren't that great, but you don't know how bad they are elsewhere. So yes, you're doing great, and I appreciate being here. So I'm going to talk about Prevent, Teach, Reinforce, which is a behavior intervention that we actually did a randomized controlled trial. It was a research project. So I'm going to get some of the researchy, boring stuff out of the way at the beginning to just set the frame for what is PTR, why we did it, and how we did it as a research project, but not a whole lot, not to bore you for long, and some of you might be interested in that. And then what I'm going to do is go into the steps of the process, what we did with over 200 school teams, and continue to do so as the project ended. And I'm going to probably borrow people's handouts to kind of see what you have to know what I sent, and I may not have the right pages aligned on the PowerPoint with the handouts and the activity packets. Do have a few activities. They're nothing that's going to be embarrassing or anything, so they're more team type of stuff. So like when you're sitting there thinking for a few minutes, think about who your team here is going to be. You might already be sitting in teams, and then you can work through the activities. So any questions you have about me before we get started? Because we'll go right into it since we have even though it seems like a long day, 9:30 to 2:30. I know there's lots of nice breaks and things, and I'm cramming now 6 hours that I usually have a hard time getting through 6 hours, and I think about 4 hours. So if I talk too fast for our interpreters, somebody give me some sign or something, because I am accused in the South always of talking too fast. In fact, my supervisor says I talk so fast I make his ears bleed sometimes. And I think I've slowed down since I've moved down to Florida. Okay, so this is kind of a basic agenda. It probably won't actually flow this way. I tend to get behind. When our first break comes, is somebody going to let me know, or do we break first for lunch?
About 10 o'clock.
10 o'clock. Okay, so somebody yell at me when it's 10. Or put up 10 fingers or anything to let me know, because I'm an hour difference and I probably will forget. And you guys will say, come on, I need to get that junk food back in the back there, even though I want a piece of fruit. Okay, here are your objectives. And we're going to keep on going and go right into what we know about functional behavior assessment. Now, this may not be true in Illinois, because I think you guys have a lot of good things going, but there may be isolated cases of this. What we know about functional behavior assessments and how they're done in school, or the Tier 3 behavior intervention process, is that Even though the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act talk about when you do functional behavior assessments, when you must do it, and that's been in the Act since 1997. Nowhere does the Act talk about how you do a functional behavior assessment. What are the procedures? What makes a good functional behavior assessment? Who should do it? And because of that absence of those policies, you have inconsistent FBAs. If you go from state to state, you're going to find people do things totally different. Some states have social workers, or some districts have social workers doing it. Some have teachers doing it. Some fill out a form and say that's an FBA and then send the kid off to another placement. So there's no uniform policy, and perhaps in Illinois, if you go across different districts, you might see people do things in a different way. I've been in some districts in which you go to a different school, and schools do it differently within a district. Because of that absence of leadership, really, some good guidelines, we have a process that for most part, most people in the school see it. This is a form that I have to fill out if I have a child in special education to get them out of my classroom and into another place. And so a form is filled out with no thoughts about actually developing a good function-based support plan that will actually prevent the behavior from happening, increase new skills to replace the problem behavior, and then reinforce those new skills. The other thing is when FBAs are done, sometimes an expert goes in, and the expert could be the counselor, the school psych, the social worker, the behavior analyst, the behavior specialist, or somebody who goes in, maybe does observations, maybe asks teachers to do data, complete some forms, and then they write a nice summary report and give you strategies to try out. Well, we call that an expert model because there's no consideration of contextual fit. There's no input from the team on what we do in our classroom, what's going to work, which one of these interventions should we select and then develop completely so it can be done in our classroom. And as a result, we have very little support or follow-up to the teacher. Now, again, I know in Illinois you have a nice flow chart of a very great process that you're using in some districts. And I don't know if that's statewide now, some of that IPBS stuff from Cindy Anderson that she's worked with Lucille Eber. It's a nice flow chart about how you support the teacher and how long you wait. So I don't know if that's statewide or that's kind of one of their demonstration OSEP projects. Okay. Well, you guys do have some glimmers of that here where there is actually built-in support, follow-up, and training for the teacher. Often we're sitting in a meeting, and for those of you that are steeped in behavior, you probably know, I know how to do providing choices. Any fool should know how to do providing choices, right? Well, no, that's because we've been doing it for years and years, and we've tried it in different ways, and it's just like second nature to us. For somebody who doesn't have that familiarity, they may not know what we mean by providing choices as an intervention, and they may be afraid to ask because they're the teacher. What does that look like in this field now where every teacher is held accountable? Do I make the error and say to everybody, I really don't know what you're talking about? Or do I just slowly put that nice little plan in my file cabinet and go on and do what I always do because I don't really know what they meant by it? So we do. No, that's not happening. The other thing is if you have teachers still facilitating FBAs and your functional behavior assessments don't seem to be effective and work, really look and see if that teacher should be the person facilitating that process, because sometimes teachers don't have the background in the principles, the behavioral principles that underlie functional behavior assessment. So unless you know that, it's pretty tough to do a good one. And there's a nice article, it's now 4 years old, from Scott and Camps. It was in Behavior Disorders. They talked about the status of FBAs in schools and pretty much said all of this and say that the facilitator should really be
Okay, we're going to go ahead and begin.
So they are looking at having other people who may have this background knowledge, this knowledge of principles, to be the people who facilitate the process. We're also looking at how to do it more so that it is feasible to do in schools. Now, I know this is small and you can't see it, and in your handout you can't see it.
Full page, if there's a star next
Yes.
to the slide, it's full page.
Thank you, Sherry. Wow, is she good. In Florida, the Department of Education in Florida does a service to Florida educators called Technical Assistance Papers, or as we like to call them in Florida, TAPs, where we tap dance, I guess. And most recently, we worked on one that looked at how do you do response to intervention for behavior, or multi-tiered system of supports for behavior. And it's been a couple of years since we finished it. I think it's going to come out. Now, what they do is they do post all the technical assistance papers on the Florida Department of Education website. And so when you can go there and check, and you're going to see some of those, and you can all download things. So eventually this will be up there. What we have here is just what are the core components that should be included in a good multi-tiered support system for behavior. So tier 1, tier 2, tier 3, and then what needs to cut across all 3 components, or the foundational components. So I'm not going to go over this whole thing since we're going to go straight to PTR. But this is the assumption is that PTR is being done hopefully in schools and districts that may have some multi-tiered support processes already in place. It will work better because there'll be less kids at tier 3 that need functional behavior assessments. If you don't have the multi-tiered system of support, you can still do PTR, but what happens is everybody who has a behavior problem looks like they need tier 3, right? If you don't have tier 1 or tier 2 in place, then if a kid has a behavior problem, the only tools you have are you just have a hammer. You're going to treat the kid just like one little nail, and without all these other things in place. And so that's a little bit bigger of what was in tier 3. So why do we do Prevent, Teach, Reinforce? 2 universities participated in this research. The University of South Florida, we did it in 3 school districts around the Tampa Bay area, and that's on the west side of Florida, the Gulf Coast, for those of you who are thinking, where is Tampa? Because I've never heard of it. And then the University of Colorado in Denver did it in 2 school districts in the state. The purpose of this research, this is one of the first research projects that was put out back in 2004, 2005, when education was being accused of not having any rigorous research. So right around No Child Left Behind being put into place and saying we had to use evidence-based practices. So then somebody said, well, what does it mean to be evidence-based? And what do we have in education? And what do we have specifically in behavior interventions that's evidence-based? We know that functional behavior assessments have a wealth of research behind, but it's been single subject research. The field likes the gold standard of randomized controlled trials. And so this was one of the projects funded to answer that call. Our main purpose of our project was to see whether or not a process that we could make standardized and consistent enough so it was done the same across multiple teams, made it collaborative and more team-driven versus expert-driven, and made it based on functional behavior assessment. Could an intervention plan based on an FBA be more effective than what kids typically get when they have behavior problems? So we compared ours to services as usual, our PTR, and how we just randomly assign, as we got people in, we randomly assigned them to either, and once we got all the consents, it was based upon the child being randomized. We didn't randomize schools. We could have one school that had 5 teachers who were all participating in the research project. 3 of them might have had kids who were assigned to treatment. 2 might have had kids who were assigned to control or waitlist control. So for those of you that are wondering about the research and all of the rest of you probably don't care. Some of you though want to know about that a little bit. We do have a couple articles, one that really describes the research, and we can probably get you to that at the end, give you that citation. So we're just really seeing if it's going to be better than what teachers typically do. Okay, thank you. I'll put it on after break. Thanks. So I don't have to stop. So we're kind of comparing it to this. So I don't know how many of you still have seen this kind of intervention, but here's a little kid. Teacher got tired of his obsessive compulsive behavior. So she said, you know what you have to do? You're going to write 100 times on the board, I will stop my obsessive compulsive behavior. Well, he's writing it on the board, and he has obsessive compulsive tendencies. He loves this. Look, he gets to make sure everything is aligned, everything is perfect. He has his little ladder to go up and down, and he's going, it just doesn't get better than this. Now, this is just a little comedy, but often our interventions that we try with kids, our typical interventions, actually make the behavior more likely to be repeated. For all of you behavioral team members, you know that principle. If you follow, after a behavior happens, you provide a consequence. And if behavior is repeated, that's actually called a reinforcement because kids are repeating. It's only a punishment if it's zeroed out. So a lot of times inadvertently we do interventions that strengthen. A real good example are kids who don't like to do work. So you have a kid who just doesn't like the task that's being presented. Maybe a writing task or something that your kid that you're working with really doesn't see as a preferred task. Child may have learned to do some problem behaviors, and as a result, maybe a lot of teachers come over and they redirect, they may start reprimanding, they may even change the materials, they may even modify and present something else. What this kid is actually learning is, if I do this behavior, I get to delay this task that I don't want to do anyways. And you know, sometimes, not always, but sometimes I actually delay so long that it's over. And now we moved on to something else that I like a whole lot better. So I actually put it off. And that's what our kids are learning sometimes inadvertently with our interventions. So in we had over 200 kids in our study. And we wanted to evenly divide treatment and control. We probably had a little more in treatment than comparison, but they were pretty well evenly divided. The kids who were in our comparison group were, because a lot of people don't like to be in control and not get the treatment, what we did is we promised them the following school year that after we got the last bit of data from them, which is follow-up, that they could then be moved into the intervention and receive the intervention the next year. And we'll show you some data from those kids. We got kids in kindergarten to 8th grade. I have a student right now who is going to try it out in high school. So get with me in a year and see how it works in high school. She's going to do a single subject design with like 4 or 5 cases, but still be interesting. We have both general and special ed. We had a couple of students, I'm going to show you in a minute, who I think were deaf or hard of hearing. We might have a couple. We had a couple with multiple disabilities and a couple with visual impairments as well. But we had a whole bunch of general educators, which surprised us. The teachers were the ones who nominated. They used a screening process called the Systematic Screening of Behavior Disorders to nominate their top 3 children who were doing externalizing behaviors. Kind of like what we told the teachers was, think of your class and think of the kid that if that child is absent, your day is like heaven. That's your top externalizer, right? You all have pictured that kid in your mind right now, right? That's the one we're going to nominate first. And now, in case we can't get the permission from the parent to work with this child, or they move or something before we start, who would take that kid's place? You know, there's always someone just wanting that job in your classroom. We also wanted kids who have pretty severe behaviors. We were hoping that they had lasted longer than 6 months. They happened often enough that we could see change if the intervention worked, and that the intensity of the behavior was disruptive enough that it stopped learning. It stopped the teacher from teaching. If you were a treatment student and team, you were given a homemade manual, kind of like what you have in your hands, except we did put it in a binder. When I first came in, I saw that you get binders for these, so we gave them a nice little binder. We didn't have the pretty little book that we have now. And then we assigned them someone from our project to be their consultant. We call them the PTR consultant. The 5-step process that PTR is aligned with the problem-solving process, or response to intervention. So the first step we do add in is teaming. We want to make sure that we have a team that's going to work together well, that we have identified some things that might keep us from working well, and that we have an agreement on how we're going to operate. The second step is goal setting. That's when we identify the problem behavior. And a very important step. Because correctly identifying problem behavior is one of the key indicators in consultation and coaching to say that you will actually resolve the problem effectively. There's a couple of research articles on that. So you want to spend some time correctly identifying what is the problem. We also get a nice teacher-friendly data collection system set up here. Third is problem analysis. That's our functional assessment. Why is the behavior or the problem occurring? Fourth is intervention. We design the intervention and start implementing it. We get coaching, and we also get fidelity scores. And finally, how well did this work? Was it effective? Evaluation. So that's our 5-step process. We're going to go real fast through just some of the data, and then we'll go into the step 1 of teaming. So you can see these are the kids that we had in our project, the different disabilities. General education, almost 39% of our sample, was really surprising. So you can see we didn't have any kids, I'm sorry, with hearing impairments in our deafness in our project. So you guys, though, are all on behavior teams, so I guess some of the kids do have behavior problems occasionally, right? Maybe just 2 or 3 in the whole United States. So the other kids, they're going to have behavior problems just like our other kids do. So it could have been, some of our kids, though, I think have multiple disabilities. We had a couple who probably did have some specific, maybe some issues. We had kids with autism. It can be very similar at times. Grade level, mostly younger kids. We were asked to get 60% of our sample from grades 1st through 3rd. So we had to concentrate more on the younger kids, but we did get some from middle school. More free and reduced lunch kids and a lot more guys than girls. Is that true in deafness community? Our boys tend to be more vocal maybe, or verbal, or out. And we see the behavior problems more in boys, and we don't see them as much in girls, or the girls' behavior problems might be more, kind of subtle, hidden. Because girls are really good at knowing how to torment people and kind of psychologically be cruel, or like the guys are just like, yeah, let's be aggressive and get it over with. Okay, so that's a bunch of, let's just go to the graphs. So did our intervention work? We had 3 major outcome measures that were reported in the research. We used the social skills rating system, the Gresham and Elliott rating scale. We had teachers complete the scale. They did it at 3 time points. I only have 2 up here right now. At baseline, before intervention started, and then at post-intervention, which usually occurred 6 to 8 weeks after we started the intervention. They did the social skills subtest, the problem behavior subtest, and then we also did academic engaged time. Academic engaged time, we sent our data collectors in 2 times at baseline, 2 times at post-intervention, and then again follow-up the next year 2 times. And what they did is directly observe the student during independent work time and kept a stopwatch running. When the child was on task, doing on-task behaviors that were carefully defined, the stopwatch ran. When a child did something that would put them off task, they stopped the stopwatch. And then this is representative of the proportion of the 15 minutes, the percentage of that 15 minutes that the child was engaged in with their materials or their work. So our group, the treatment group, is the darker line. And the comparison group is kind of the pink purpley color. So social skills, we want to see that get better. So we want to see that increase. Our kids who got PTR increased significantly from baseline to post-intervention compared to the control group who was getting business as usual. So that we do know we could increase the social skills. We decreased the problem behavior significantly, and we were surprised, increased their academic engaged time, and all of these were considered significant. These are our kids now who were the pink kids in the previous graph. These are our kids who were the control kids that crossed over into treatment. We compared their performance with how they did when they were still our control kids to see if they did better. They replicated our randomized controlled trial. Compared to their previous year performance, they significantly increased their social skills, significantly decreased problem behavior, and significantly increased academic engaged time. So we feel we have an intervention that is effective. How effective is it for teachers? Almost all of our teachers were able to implement their interventions with at least 80% accuracy. So we did provide that support, and our goal was to get them to 80%. The average number of times we had to go in and observe and provide feedback and support was about 3.5 times. Not too long, not too many times. Though what we do also know is our intervention plan has 3 interventions: prevent, teach, and reinforce, just like our name. They do the prevention interventions at a higher rate of accuracy than the teach and the reinforce. And we think they must like them better too, because anything that prevents the problem behavior from even happening is certainly more preferable for teachers to do if they know that's going to stop the behavior. Social validity. This is how well did the teachers accept the process and did they think it was effective? It's a 5-point scale, with 5 being more positive about it, 1 being not so great, not so hot. Overall, with 124 teachers who completed it, we had an overall score of 4.2 of all 15 questions. And we had the highest rating on how willing was I to carry out this plan. We got a 4.8. Almost everyone said 4 or 5 on that one. And you'll see why when we get to the interventions. It's because it is their intervention, basically, with our guidance. And then alliance. This is to see the relationship between the consultant who guided the team and the teacher. The teachers, again, really rated the consultant high. And the theory behind that is the more respect, the more higher quality the relationship is of the consultant and the consultee, or the teacher and the person going out to guide them, the more likely the teacher is going to implement interventions. So let's go through the process, and I think we have about 5 minutes, is that correct, for break? So somebody just give the universal break sign when it is 10 o'clock, and we'll be able to break at the right time. So our first step is teaming. Because this is a collaborative process, we want to make sure we have a team. Now, our dream was to have at least 3 levels of knowledge represented. The field is trying to move away from roles, like should there be a school psych on it? Should there be a behavior analyst? Should there be a principal on it? Who are the people that should be on it? Instead, we want to make sure 3 levels of knowledge are represented. So we definitely need, first most, a person who knows the student. Right? They have to know what the behavior looks like, when the behavior happens. They have to be able to help us analyze the problem. They have to be able to carry out the intervention. So that's typically the teacher, the parent, para-educators or instructional assistants, and anybody else who is impacted by the behavior knows the student well. Second level of knowledge we need is we need somebody who represents that knowledge of how do you do a functional behavior assessment and knows behavior interventions. So whoever that is in the district or the team or the campus needs to be available to guide that team to make the right decisions. Even though we say it's team teacher driven, we're kind of like the GPS device. We don't let them, well, there are some GPS devices I've heard that have let people drive into lakes and things, but we try very hard if they veer off course to recalculate and get them back as close as possible to the route we know will be more effective. And then we also need someone with the knowledge of the context, knows the resources that are available, can help say, yes, you're allowed to do that. That may be a principal, an administrator, or some other person they designate. Purpose of our step 1 teaming is we want to see what are the strengths and weaknesses of this team. How do they work together? Have they worked together as a team? A lot of our people that we got in our research never worked together as a team. A lot of the general educators don't have, like special ed, where they have IEP meetings and they have regular team meetings to talk about the plan. So this was a new concept to them to work as a team around behavior. This was before RTI was really starting to get its steam. We also talked about how do we know who's going to do what? Who's going to be the main person who's going to do the intervention in this team? Because that person is the one that's going to get the most weight on the decisions, and also the person we're going to target for helping to support them to implement the interventions. We also want to outline or come up with, if we disagree, how we're going to agree to disagree and carry on with the process. So this will be a good activity to take us to break. Yes?
I made a mistake. Break is 10:45 to 11. Lunch is at 12:15.
Okay, we have time. Good. I was going to say, wow, they start at 9:30, they get a break at 10. Man, that's good. You guys will never get tired then. Okay, so what I want you to do first, for 60 seconds, and I don't know if this is big in the packet or not. It might be. Sometimes I send one with it. Okay, yeah, you do have one. What page is it on? It's right behind the first activity page, yes. So now you have a big one. So what I want you to do is, I want you on your own, being quiet, not talking to your neighbor, for 1 minute. I want you to see if you can figure out how many squares are in this design. Okay, so 1 minute. Okay, stop. So put your hands up and keep your hands up until I come to a number you didn't find. So how many people found at least 30 squares? How many of you, keep your hands up if you found at least 40 squares? Keep your hands up if you found 50, 60, 70. How many did you find? 81. Whoa, okay, pretty good. And there were a couple of 60s here? 66? Oh, there's a 70. A 76 over here. Anybody else in the 70s? Okay, now here's what I want you to do. And you all can't go to the team that has the person who found 76 or 81. I want you in your teams now, and you define what your team is, to look at this design and come to a consensus on the number of squares that are in this design.
Okay, all right.
So, how many squares did you find? Let's again go through what we did before. How many teams found at least 40 squares? Keep your hands up as if as a team you found 50 squares. 60, 70, 80. Okay, we have that one team. Oh, good. Okay, so there were a lot of 60s. Now, you had found 76. Okay, she said, I found by myself I could find 76, but when I was explaining it to them, I could only get 57 or something. Maybe you just ran out of time explaining it. That could be it. Anyone else? Was your team were you able to explain the 81, or are you sticking with what by yourself?
When I started explaining it, I saw all the flaws in my theory.
She says she found all the flaws in her theory when she started explaining it, but hey, I like her. She's keeping her head up. She's going with 81 or 82, and that's her story. How many of you found more squares as a team? Okay, almost everyone. A couple of you fell back and your explanations, but in general, most of you found more. Why? What was different about doing it as a team?
Different perspectives.
Yeah, the big one. Different people viewed the squares and how you count them in a different way. Some people would say, did you count the big square as a square? And some of you would have said, oh, we forgot that. Some of you might have forgotten that now. You're adding it to your little count. Some people see the little squares in very different ways and see the different permutations or different representations of small squares. So there's a lot of different ways to look at this that when we only look at it with our perspective, we aren't seeing the bigger picture. And so, oh, she's really jumping up. She's asking how many squares. Hold on, hold that thought for a minute. The other thing is within your team, did you guys take on different roles? Was there somebody, not roles like you eat, because I don't say it right, but roles like how you work with the team? Did one of you kind of coordinate it so people weren't getting off task? Did somebody keep count of the squares so that you didn't double count any squares? I saw one, I think this team here, they had somebody who must have either an artistic or a mathematical background who was doing some things with making them cubes and things like that. I think you were doing it. And I thought, oh, maybe that's a better way of seeing all of them. So sometimes we see different people taking different positions or roles in this activity. So the question is, how many squares are there? Well, I hate to tell you this, but we're not sure exactly what is the right answer. But is that any different from when you work with people? Do you always have the right answer when you're working with children or you're working with teams? Sometimes we have to agree that we have enough information and that we agree that this is our action we'll take. However, I'll give you some help. We think there's at least 72 squares in this. And the reason we think this is one Saturday morning, one of our colleagues was giving a person-centered planning training to the school district. And I guess a 13-year-old girl was being punished because her mom took her to the workshop. And so, you know, most adults don't want to go to workshop Saturday morning. So you know she had to have done something really bad to not be able to stay home. Well, she was really bored until he got to this activity. And then she perked up. She got a little thing of Post-it notes, you know, little sticky notes. And for the rest of the training, she drew this design on each one of those Post-it notes and then shaded in a different square. At the end of the training, we counted, and she had 72. So that's why we think, you know, it's non-scientific. We think there must be at least 72. She had a lot of time to think about it, 3 hours to think about how many squares are in here, so she had more than your 2 or 3 minutes. I also have given this presentation a couple of times to other groups, and I've had occasionally mathematicians in the group who told me there's a formula to figure out how many squares there are, and I don't know what that formula is, but they keep on telling me there's either 72, 74, or 76. And then finally, one guy, I think he lied to me though. He told me he Googled it. I don't even know how you Google this. And he said the answer is 72 or 74 or 76. So now, what I do ask for you guys, if you did not find 72, 74, or 76, do not spend the rest of today during the presentation going back to this saying, where are those other 30 or 20 that I missed? Give it to your kids to work on. So what do we do to figure out how a team functions? And these are activities that I think you can use not just for behavior intervention teams, but for teams in general. We borrowed a lot of these forms from the Maryland Friend, I think, is the person who does a lot of work with paraprofessionals. And you have the forms, you have all of these in the blank form handouts, by the way. So you have a pack that says PTR blank forms. I think you have all of these forms as well as, I think I've included most of them. So let me go ahead and see if my hyperlinks work, or we'll show you. The first one that we have is a classroom team survey. If the team, or if the people working on this behavior issue have operated as a team in the past, we have them complete this classroom team survey. Now what we do is we had everybody complete things independently, and then they fax them to us. When we originally did this as a research project, each step was a meeting. So we had 5 meetings total. We are now doing it feasibly in the schools that it's not a research project. We are streamlining it, but we try to figure out what can we get ahead of time so that you're not spending as much time in the meeting completing things. So this could still be completed by each person ahead of time, because again, remember that different perspective? When we do things as a team, sometimes people, especially paraeducators who are on the team, may not feel brave enough to contradict the teacher. And by the same token, there are some paraeducators who are stronger than the teachers, right? Because they've been there longer and they've seen a lot of teachers flow through, and they may be a bit stronger and outspoken than the teacher. So we want to make sure we get everybody's perspective. So they answer these questions on a rating scale. What we do as a facilitator is we summarize everything and present it back at the meeting and have them talk about what they see that's strong, a strength, and what they might see as things they have to either clarify or think about and how it's going to impact the intervention. Now, for example, our team meets for planning purposes. Let's say you have a couple people on your team, 3 people. One person says, 2 people say, we meet weekly. And another person says, we meet monthly or bi-monthly. So now you as the facilitator would be saying, there's something not right here, because one person of this team either isn't being invited to some meetings, doesn't know a meeting's happening, or maybe it's defining meeting in a very different way. But that would be an example of something we might hope the team will address. And if they don't address it on their own, because usually we tend to let them talk more than us, then we might say, you know, I looked at number one, and number one, I noticed there's some differences in a couple of people and how often they think these meetings happen. Somebody kind of explain maybe why this perspective is here, or why this is existing in this team. So you want to kind of get an idea. You can't fix it. This is not for the purpose of fixing it, but the purpose of figuring out how they work together. So it looks like good teaming practices. There's about 8 questions that they have a little rating scale, and then there's some open-ended questions that talk about how they operate as a team. Now, if they did not ever operate as a team before this meeting, and we did, like I said, have some teams, then we didn't do the teaming survey because they would not be able to answer the questions since they didn't operate as a team. The other thing we did is we wanted to see if there was a teacher and a paraeducator working together. And in Illinois, what do you call your aides and instructional assistants? Paraprofessionals. Okay? If there was a teacher and a paraprofessional or more than one paraprofessional working as a team in a classroom, we asked them to complete these Workstyle surveys. Now, these are kind of fun to complete because they're kind of like, you know, when you get those magazines that are like Glamour and Cosmo and all of those, and you do those surveys about how, how I can make sure I keep my guy interested in me or whatever, and you do like all those little rating things about your personality and stuff. Well, that's kind of what this is. Although it's not about maybe I don't know if it's about keeping your aide maybe or your paraprofessional. So for the teacher's Workstyle survey, looks at it from the perspective of how she supervises and sets up her classroom for paraeducators or paraprofessionals. So the first question is, does she supervise paraeducators closely? 1 is disagree, 5 is agree. So he indicates their level of their agreement with each of these questions. Now we go into some specific things. Does she like a flexible work schedule? Does he or she let paraprofessionals know exactly what's going to happen and what's going to be expected of them? Does he or she provide or determine all the materials? Do they provide a written work schedule? Do they expect the paraeducator to think ahead? So we get some ideas, and you have this in your blank packet. And you are allowed to reproduce anything. And also, I did send Sherry the electronic versions. If anybody wants to modify it, you have our permission to do that as well. You can give them the electronic version as well for them to have the forms and things. Now, we also have the paraprofessional complete this. But it's from the perspective of being supervised and working in this classroom with the teacher. So they have the exact same questions, but just turned around. I like to be supervised closely. I prefer a flexible work schedule. I like to know exactly what is expected. I like having a written work schedule. I need time to think about the next task. So now can you kind of see where this is going? What we do is we compare the ratings. And we try to keep it anonymous, although if you have one teacher and one paraeducator, there's no way you could be anonymous, right? So everybody knows that who answered what. But if you have a couple paraeducators, at least you have a little wiggle room there. And we just compare it. The one that is in our book, it looks like this. The middle kind of gives the main part of the STEM, the main thing that is being asked about. And then on the left side, we put the paraprofessionals' ratings. On the right side, we put the teachers' ratings. If there's more than one paraprofessional, people did them in various ways. Sometimes people would circle all of the responses. So if there were 2 paraeducators and one said 2 and one said 3, you'd see a 2 and a 3 circled. Some would do a mean if there were lots of paraprofessionals, that would get too confusing. There are all different ways that you could do it. But the main point is that you want to see is what works good for this team in their style, and maybe some things to think about. So, for example, we have a teacher who says, I expect the paraprofessionals to be able to think ahead to the next task. And the paraeducators think, I need time. So there's a big difference. Maybe a 2 from the paraprofessional side, a 5 or a 4 from the teacher side. There's an issue there. Now, again, we didn't fix it in our team. And what we usually do is we bring back the summary and say to the team, you know, look at this for a few minutes. What do you think? These were your responses. Is there anything there you see that really shows how you're